Thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can hear me well. Thank you for inviting me to attend the conclave, even though I'm a long way away in Bendigo in Victoria, Australia. But I've participated before with the conclave, and I'm very, very happy to do it again. So I hope you had a wonderful day yesterday, and I hope the presentation I'm about to give will provide some insight into the issues around national critical infrastructure. The concern about national critical infrastructure has been growing regularly as we become more interconnected. You'll see in this first slide that introduces me a little picture on the side, and it, in a very small way, starts to indicate the interlinkages between all elements of critical infrastructure. So I'm going to talk about that, particularly in the cyberspace context. So what I've put up here is a picture of an organizational model. So you have the culture of an organization, the governance, how it's managed, strategy and operations to do its job. Then you have protective security. Now, the point about protective security is it's not just cyber, it's not just physical, it's not just people, it's not about just information alone. It's how you converge and interoperate with these, how you integrate those through the decision-making processes of your organization in order to make sure that you can manage risk. So let's have a look at some of the things. Clearly, emergency and disaster management, many of you will be expertise in this, but within the organisation of an institution such as this, you need to think, how does your culture respond to disasters? Are they active? Are they engaged? Do they plan ahead? You need to think too, in crisis management, when a disaster strikes that is of such impact, it destroys lives, destroys businesses, etc. Do you have the processes in place to manage a crisis, to direct your resources very much focused on achieving that outcome? Recovery. There's no point in not having a recovery strategy when something happens, whether it's after floods or earthquakes or some other natural event, whether it's after some criminal or security event. You need to have a recovery process engaged in getting it right. And lastly, you do these things by being resilient. And I talked about resilience at last year's meeting, and I'm happy to talk about it again at this one, because ultimately resilience is a measure of how adaptive you are as an organisation. And I'll talk about resilience a little bit more as I go through. So what's critical infrastructure? There's a number of definitions. I'm drawing from an Australian strategy, which has just been updated, and you can get it online. So if you were to put in critical infrastructure resilience strategy for Australia, you'd probably be able to download the document. But again, they've got a list, and that list started off with only 4 groups in critical infrastructure. Now, under our legislation, there's, as you can see, communications, financial services, data processing, storage, and so on. Interesting enough, I have a particular interest for 2 reasons. One, as an Australian who wants to be able to preserve our community, but also in the company Thales, where I'm now advising the board of directors on risk and security. What is it we've got to be involved in to meet the security and recovery and resilience requirements in the parts of the industry that we're involved in? And let's just have a look at these pictures. We're involved in national security in Thales. We actually supply 90% of all the banking cryptography in the world. We provide IoT and operational technologies into the energy sector. We provide encryption for the cloud. Just alone in space, we have 240 satellites that we've produced for the European Space Agency. And clearly, you can't do that without research. We've recently done a range of transport options all around the world, including here in Australia, communications with satellite technology, as well as landline and encrypted communications. We're not in water, and while we do supply some health products, we're not really in health, but very much so in the defence and national security. So I, as a risk manager, I, as a leader around issues associated with security and disaster management, has to be really conscious that as a company, we're involved in 6 of the regulated components for our legislation. But whether you have regulation or not doesn't really matter too much, because it's about doing business the right way, doing all the things that you need to do to have a good business and make that business sustainable. So moving on. Here's another model. This is the US one. They've got 16 critical infrastructure sectors. And Again, they show some interconnections here. So they have a memorandum recently issued by the President of the United States to really emphasize the protection of nations' critical infrastructure at all levels. And growing issues that are facing them is degradation, destruction, and malfunctions of systems. Now, when you think about what a cyber attack can do in terms of degradation, destruction, or malfunction, you can see why it is right up there at the top of the list of threats to be worried about. Now, this very beautiful picture is a map of major node points representing the web. And the web is really hard to present. As complex as all these little dots are, they do not present anything more than a congregation of users and servers. And it's very, very interesting to look at it. There's clearly black spots which reflect population density. When you look across to the US and Europe and India, and Australia being empty pretty much in the middle, along the Australian coast, you will see very, very developed cyber capabilities. Similarly, in southeastern China and Japan. So what we're looking at is a global arrangement. And there's a lot of work going on to map how the internet works together, but so many of the things we do are dependent on it being available. Now, what happens, of course, is the networks themselves are like a spider's web. They're all entwined, not just one spider's web, multiple webs interrelating with each other. That's why they call it. It's important to understand that these web structures, they're not linear, they're multi-level, and they can relate together. But sometimes there's a critical point that if broken, can have a cascading effect down through those links of those spider webs that I'm using as an example. And then outside that, there's a whole range of other web-related activities in terms of military webs, satellite comms, and so on. And these things occasionally cross over. So a problem in any one of these domains, in any one of these networks, and a company like Thales, for example, is in multiple networks. So have you got your barriers in place? Do you know what's going on in each one? Can you reduce your risk? All of the questions that you need to ask. So here's another two different maps. And I mean, they look like maps of the solar system. They look like maps of outer space. But these are maps that are mapping either nodes or users on the internet. This is some really interesting examples of how these things work. And why I'm putting these up is you cannot develop a cybersecurity strategy for critical infrastructure unless you have mapped all the relationships. Up in the top right-hand corner as you face your screen, you've got the rapid interorganizational networks for tsunamis. Now, this is based on the tsunami that had major impact in Southeast Asia, but the communications network, you can see there are some critical nodes that linked everything together, and there were places that people need to go out to. What this hasn't done is illustrate the interconnectivity, but that's implied by the top right-hand corner of that chart. Similarly, one of the things that these look like to me is maps of the nervous system, ganglions and so on. So when I think about how cyberspace works, I liken it very much to components of the human body that make it work. You've got the obvious one, which is the nervous system that carries messages around the body. But the internet without security would be like us without the white blood cells in our body that protect us from disease. So the metaphors used about cyber, such as virus, become really stark when you see maps that look like maps of the human nervous system. So the attacks are real. The figure that from 2013 to 2020, that there's been a 3,900% increase. That's phenomenal. This is more than exponential. The problem is we've approached it from a network-centric point of view, and therefore you protect your own networks, and you don't always think about the impact on others. And why I put operational technology in there, most of the critical infrastructure, while communicating like other businesses do, on a secondary level, has operational technology that opens valves, turns on pumps, allows liquid to flow, monitors the rate of electricity and readjusts. All of those things are generally not connected to the internet, but when they are, as has been the case in a couple of countries, the normal process, the normal cyberspace access that a business has could lead to access for a criminal or other adversary on the operational technology. And that's the one that's going to hurt. So you really need to think about what control systems you have in place. And I don't need to talk to you folk about Stuxnet and the attack on the Iranian nuclear computer. All of those were actually about getting access to the operational technology. So it's worth having a look at the Gartner reporting. Gartner, I find, is a really good source of general information without too much bias about what it is. But we have a lot of problems in our legacy infrastructure, and some of our, and I'm sure it's the same case in India and other parts of Asia, the infrastructure we've got is using very old systems of Microsoft or Apple, have never been upgraded because of the cost of upgrading. With these increased threats, upgrading becomes really important, putting in the protections that you need. So we have seen, and I don't need to talk about what's been happening in Ukraine, but we have seen massive attacks attempting to bring down critical infrastructure. Before that, there were cyber attacks closing off banks, closing off sources of supply. So I think we have to be really conscious of this. So this is a quote which I actually used talking to this conclave previously. This quote comes from Star Trek, and the commander of the ship, the Relativity, which was a space-time ship, said to his first officer, "I want a risk-free solution." Well, there isn't any such thing. What you can hope to do is monitor this. So the answer of the Spock-like figure, if you follow Star Trek, uncertainty is part of the equation. It is, it's absolutely, but it's not just part, it also can have major effects on the consequence of any equation. So I won't go through that, but it's important to think about how judgment is affected by perception, how the perception of consequence and the objectives you're trying to reach, either positive or negative, have an effect on how you decide things. And the more complex the system, the more difficult it is to be predictive in what the outcomes might be. So I'm going to talk a little bit about risk. Now, this, for those social scientists in the room, the picture in the middle is a standard normal distribution. So when you survey humans about anything from height to enjoyment of particular types of food, you will get a distribution. The smaller the number, the more skewed that distribution is going to be. But let's look at people who are very, very nervous about making decisions, who are concerned that the consequence might be worse than actually taking a chance to get what they want. They're going to sit at the certain end of the spectrum. They want much more certainty before they'll make a decision to act. They want more controls in. But of course, to get to a point of certainty where they're comfortable, where the sources of risk are fully comprehended, emergent risks have been identified, where you actually are in the clear and know, is very, very rare. Entrepreneurs, on the other hand, risk takers, they're at the other end of the spectrum. They don't mind if it's a bit uncertain, if it's emerging. They look for those changes to create benefit for themselves. No side is right or wrong, and you have to be really careful about this sort of modelling, because if you're looking after human lives, you clearly want to be in the certain known risk end where you understand the risk. If you're hoping to corner the market through some speculation on the stock exchange, well, you're clearly going to operate up at the other, because you can't get all the information that you need to do that. You'll see some words down the bottom. Depending on the environment you're in, the stock exchange being one where it's very ambiguous and very changeable and very volatile, depending on the environment you're in, it has characteristics that either help you get certainty and keep certainty in play, and others that are changing things rapidly. So you need to do lots and lots of work on information gathering and assessment, because a chaotic system is hard to read, and a stable system is likely to break. A system that's volatile will change very quickly. So as you work through thinking about any problem, you can use models like this to work on it. Now, in the case of critical infrastructure, as a member of the public, I don't want my electricity to fail. I don't want my water to fail. I don't want my gas to fail. I don't want my street cleaning. I want to be able to use the phone when I need it. I want to be able to fill my car up with petrol when I want to. Now, therefore, I look to the people who provide that to operate at the certainty end of the spectrum. If they operate at the uncertainty end of the spectrum, we'd have real trouble in managing our society because we depend so much on these things. So when you get into critical infrastructure, judgments about them should be and tend to be on the right-hand side, the certain side. But there's often high uncertainty associated with them. So people make decisions the best they can, but emergent and uncertain information can really sneak up on it, particularly when it's a natural hazard. So whether it's here or India, but particularly here lately, we've had floods that we haven't had before in terms of numbers of volume, and as in other parts of Asia. If you built your models for levees, you built your models for dams, you would be working on principles of previous observations and some modeling, and you would try to move in the direction of certainty. But when you have dramatic events that are outside the normal predictions, then being at that end rather than having an adaptive model isn't quite so useful. And we'll talk about that more as we go through. So, what happens if the energy sector fails? This is the one that I'm particularly interested in. When the energy sector fails, that's the provision of gas and electricity. These are the things that happen. And let's have some pity on the poor people of the Ukraine, who 10 million people have lost access to power as a result of Russian missiles. So destruction of medical supplies, particularly the ones that need to be kept cool, instability of food and groceries, water supply, sanitation, and with that brings illness, disease, pandemics. Impact in telecommunications, people cannot talk. So, we had problems in Australia overseas who were trying to get help with a breakdown in the networks, they couldn't get there. Particularly transport disruption. How much in some cities are the traffic lights controlled by a computer system, where basically when the traffic lights go out in Mumbai or in New Delhi, what would happen? You just need to imagine that. When the banks shut down, how do you buy food? And if the banks aren't working properly, you can't go in with your card and swipe it and get something to eat. Do you, as a necessity, carry some cash around? In the bigger sense, though, at government, it's interesting that the tanks have responded very effectively. So the banks in Australia have set up what they call deployable banking ATM machines. And so when there's a disaster like there was with floods in Brisbane, they were able to get banking machines out to the rescue centres where people were having to stay because their houses were flooded. They've got them out there and they can do banking, which they wouldn't be able to do in their normal environment, and because they haven't got anywhere to go because their cars have been sunk in the water and they've got to stay with their family and so on. This has provided them with what they need to go to a local grocery shop. So as you move through that, businesses and governments would cease to function. And that's just one element. Now, of course, cyberspace can provide the vector to allow an attack on these things, whether a natural disaster can wipe out reserves and stations, power poles, and so on. So you need to have a view of how your business operates and how business operates more generally in respect to how your organisation. And you'll see I've got a copy of something here. There's a drawing, not unlike what we had at the front of the talk of organisation and culture and behaviour, governance, business operations. If you haven't got a security management program that looks at not just your security, but the security of your supply chain, you're not going to be positioned, and you should be looking at it from the physical security, cyber security, information, and people, because people are both the weakest link on one hand, and they're also the strength of the company. Excuse me a second. So there's a bunch of principles over there, but security convergence is you need to think holistically how these things integrate together to get a good security result. Now, every organization has sources of threat. I've looked at the human threats here, and therefore your protective security regime has to deal with all of these. One of the greatest risks for critical infrastructure protection is in the control systems and information communication systems that manage those systems. Now, an insider is a person who can do the most damage. Why they become a threat will be their personal reason, recruited by a foreign power, whatever it might be. But you need to have built in the monitoring of people whose behaviours and attitudes, through hearing from their supervisors or their work peers, potentially are posing a threat. You need to make sure your physical security access controls only allow those who need to get in to get in. You, with your cyber controls, you should only allow people into those areas of access which they need to do their job, and so on. So this little model here is trying to say in each of those security domains of practice, you can use a model originally developed by cyber people that's about sustaining confidentiality of your goods, assets, and information, the integrity of those, they haven't been turned or changed in any way, and they're accessible to those who need to use them. Without accessibility, there's no profit. So the convergence model I talked about earlier is really critical in ensuring that you can create confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility. Now, confidentiality often is about access control, whether it's digital access or physical access. So therefore, it tends to work against accessibility. And that's where the risk judgment comes in. We need to let people in order to do their work. How do we manage the consequential risk of doing that? And you need to think about that. The integrity of the information is ensuring that you can identify when and wherever information is being changed. One of the strategies of the newer breed of cyber criminals is to change your data, not just hijack it for ransomware, but actually change your data to bring your company into problems and disrepute. So here is a big list of key things that can happen. Now, when you look across into disruption of acts of nature, Indonesia, for example, is particularly prone to landslides in the period of the wet season. Australia, particularly prone to bushfire and drought. Earthquakes in what we call the Arc of the Pacific through to Japan, highly influential for that. Magnetic pulses is a major sunspot that disrupts your control systems, your navigating. So let's think about this. If you use your phone to navigate, to find places, it's depending on a bunch of satellites where a major electronic pulse from the sun can take those satellites out, as it did with some of the system put up by Elon Musk. So you've got a situation where you've got other natural hazards, tsunamis. We all know what happened in the Christmas tsunami. So all of those are important. But then you can get systems that fail because of the engineering in the system or the nature of the system. So if you get an old airline control system, not only have death and crashes, you have major interruptions to business because people, technicians and engineers travel around, not doing it. The cyber system's failure can mean anything from you can't do your accounts to people can't communicate anymore. I mean, it is probably the biggest one because of our dependencies that we need to be worrying about. And then, of course, an event could be a release of dangerous chemicals. But when I look at it, the power and energy sector failure, for me, is amongst the most critical. Without water, without heat, without access to the things that drive the machines of everyday life, our phones, our computers, etc., there's a real issue there. And that's why there's sort of in Australia the number one focus for government. But road failure, infrastructure failure, trains, etc., any of those things going wrong for whatever reason is a problem. And what's the most dangerous thing? It's negligence or stupidity. People who don't follow the rules, follow their own shortcuts, don't pay attention. So many of the attacks that I've seen have been successful is people opening the wrong email that they shouldn't open, not paying attention to security protocols that the company or the business unit or the government have put in place. All those other things often follow from that. These are all things that can happen in the workplace that impact potentially on capacity. Now, I'm going to go very quickly now because I've got a lot of material and I've only got half an hour. I'm already 24 minutes into it. here's another way of looking at the same model. I've put it in, you've got the slides, so I'm not going to go through, but we're trying to prevent harm, prevent breaches of access so people can't misuse what they get to, and we need to have a protect from the loss of assets. So vulnerability is something that you need to address. Given the fact that we can show that there are many potential adversaries out there, you need to look at the nature of what it is you're looking at. You can use Guide 73 to help you, and understand vulnerability. A vulnerability isn't dangerous unless it's potentially exposed to a threat actor or a natural hazard. So again, you need to be thinking about those, not just in respect to your business, in respect to who supplies you, and whose supply to you is critical. Because if that supply to you was critical, you can go out of business because of their mistake, not yours. So there's a lot of definitional stuff here. I'm not going to go through it in detail. You can read this, but it does explain how this operates in decision making. So very quickly, I want to let you know there's places to go and get help. Cybersecurity, the 27,000 series, 27,000, 27,001, 27,005. There's cybersecurity standards. That family of standards for a non-IT practitioner can be quite useful in terms of the top five. There's so many others within that group that you don't really want to look at all of them unless you're a computer person. But as a manager, you need to understand what 27,001 is asking of you to provide computer security. Here's some of the titles. You can see in there: General Management, Code of Practice, Information Security Management on Techniques, and so on and so forth. And these are available at cost, of course, from IEC or ISO. So the other group where you can actually get lots of free material to help you do this is the NIST, the science unit from the United States, who do a huge amount of work. And you can just go online and download them. So we talked about IoT devices. There's a guidance for government users on IoT. That's 800-213. So the other thing that they provide makes life really easy to get into understanding all this. This information security handbook, you can download that, and they update it every now and again. But if you're needing to look at your cyber security, you should go here first. Certainly, you should make yourself familiar with this before you employ anyone, because the sort of questions you need to ask will come out of studying these documents. So, just so you know, ISO 27000 and the US NIST program aren't terribly different. There's a box on the side there that shows equivalencies. I'm not going to go through all of those now. If you're interested in cyber protection, you really should be looking at these. And there are some others. So again, there's a process here to deal with enterprise risk management from a cyber perspective. Again, I'm not going to go through it all in detail. You've got the slides. You can look up this material from the NIST, and I would recommend that, and the ISO IEC material. Now, this is what risk management used to look like, and here's a more what I call iterative version. You can see that's been expanded, and we'll soon have a more advanced version now, which I'm going to show you a glimpse of. So this is the model that we've developed in Australia for an Australian standard on high uncertainty, high impact events that would cause disruption. In other words, people would use the common term, they're high risk events. So some of it's exactly the same. Certainly the framework management process, the principles, they're exactly the same as ISO 31000, and the concept and labels in there. We've added a framework mechanism, and you'll see that the circle on the bottom is an incomplete circle, because what we're saying with that is it has to keep going back on itself, and that's dependent on how volatile the environment is and other variables that you can identify. So it's an adaptive model for risk management. So Frank, this is a slide from the last time some of us from International Standards spoke. This was Frank's side. It has a bunch of standards and how they relate together in an integrated management system. Certainly some of these are absolutely worth looking at should you be looking at critical infrastructure. This is my last slide, and I've gone nearly about to go over time. This diagram here was originally designed as an incident management diagram. So you have organisation protections in space, rules and processes. Then there's an incident, which means some of them didn't work. Then you do a review. But what I'm saying in this slide is, unless you look at all of your security domains on the basis of an incident, and often incidents are investigated just by the safety people, it may actually have been a security issue that led to the problem. So, or it might have been a cyber issue, or it might be a HR issue. So when you do your not just your impact analysis, but your root cause analysis, you need to ensure that you learn anything that you can put in new controls to reduce vulnerability in the post-event activity. So again, this is actually a circular one because other events that you fail to identify may happen. So that's really it for me. I don't know if I can take questions on this particular seminar, but I have just run over time by 1 minute. Thank you. So, all done. I'm just waiting for the studio to come back on.
Thank you so much, Mr. Brown. Can we take some questions from here?
I'm happy to take questions if I'm not sure how they can be delivered to me, but I'll listen carefully.
Do we have any question? So thank you, sir, for your keynote address.
No, thank you. And certainly if people want more material, they can reach out via the Institute, and I'll be very happy to guide them. And if they just follow some of these slides, particularly on the strategy handbook for critical infrastructure, the NIST program and the standards, you'll find more than enough material to help you start to address the problems. So I'd like to thank the coordinators very much, and I'm hoping you have a wonderful rest of the conference.